Good morning. It's Monday, and it is June 9th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 612 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back yet again to the FDD Morning Brief. A potential bombshell yesterday out of Gaza. Israeli Channel 12 reports that documents found during IDF operations in Gaza show close cooperation between Qatar and Hamas to thwart Donald Trump's first-term peace plan between Israel and the Palestinians, including his push for normalization between Arab states and Israel. Bear in mind that this was the signature Middle East foreign policy for Trump, so it's a fair bet that he would not be pleased to hear this. The Channel 12 report also says the documents reveal that Qatar helped Hamas carry out the 10/7 slaughter that dragged the entire region into war. We're going to need to get a full translation of those documents and try to validate them. But if any of this pans out, it could be important. Nobody can ever accuse us here at the FDD Morning Brief of ignoring the Middle East. This program was literally born out of the war in Gaza, and our plan is to continue chronicling this war until it ends. But today we're shifting gears a bit to talk about another conflict, the one Russia is fighting against Ukraine. And it's the right time to do so. Lots going on and not all bad news for a change. So we've invited FDD's founder and president, Cliff May, on the program to help us break it all down. We're going to touch on the Middle East too. So stick around. That conversation is coming up in just a few shakes of a Siberian husky's tail. Israeli forces found the body of Hamas leader Mohammed Sinwar in a tunnel under a Gaza hospital yesterday. This was a huge milestone in the war. First, let's remember that while his brother Yahya Sinwar was the mastermind of this war, it was Mohammed who was in the field coordinating with commanders. Now he's dead. And guess what? When I look at the list of Hamas leaders at the start of this war, 95% of them are dead too. The IDF's battlefield achievements are now undeniable. Dare I say it? Israel appears to have won. I know the remaining hostages haven't been returned, and I know Hamas is still recruiting fighters who are stealing aid and killing IDF soldiers. This means that tactically, the war is not over. But continued massive ground operations, I'm not sure they're going to accomplish much strategically at this point. The deaths of both Sinwar brothers, along with all the other damage that Hamas has incurred, tells me that it's time for Israel to at least reassess the trajectory of this war. I don't mean a full withdrawal, but can Israel continue to operate in Gaza the way it operates in Lebanon or Syria or Judea and Samaria? I realize that it's easy for me to say this here in Washington. I have the luxury of analyzing this rationally from afar, but I think I'm seeing things for what they are. Hamas is toast, burnt toast, and the threat it can pose to Israel is likely negligible for years and years to come. Now for your headlines. Headline one, Iranian intelligence agencies say they've acquired a cache of sensitive Israeli documents. Some of the documents may be related to Israel's nuclear facilities. Others may be about Israeli defense plans. Tehran says it obtained thousands of documents, images, and videos through a covert intelligence operation that reportedly involved 2 Israeli intermediaries. This feels like a much less meaningful parallel to the 2018 operation when Mossad agents boosted Iran's entire nuclear archive and then took it all out of the country, right under the nose of the regime. Iranian media named the Israeli agents as Roy Mizrahi and Almog Atias. Israeli authorities arrested both men last month on suspicion of spying for Iran, but there's a lot we don't know here. The regime has provided approximately zero evidence of what they say they stole, and Israel hasn't commented on the potential breach. We're going to keep tracking this and report back in the days and weeks ahead. Headline 2, Al-Qaeda in Yemen is back in the spotlight. Over the weekend, the leader of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP, burst onto the scene with a 30-minute speech calling for lone wolf attacks against Egyptian, Jordanian, and Gulf leaders. Footage of the speech that circulated online showed images of President Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, and even Elon Musk. I guess it's a little out of date. Safe to say that AQAP wants our guys dead too. Al-Qaeda's presence in Yemen goes back decades. I actually visited Yemen in 2003 to research this exact group. That was at the height of what we once called the War on Terror. That war continues to this day, even if we don't say it out loud. The group's leader, Saad bin Atef al-Awlaki, has a $6 million bounty on his head. And I'm guessing there is a U.S. Reaper drone with his name on it circling right now in the skies over Yemen. By the by, you know who's historically funded AQAP? The Qataris. Just saying. Headline 3, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, may soon be a thing of the past. Woohoo! Yesterday, reports surfaced that the Trump administration has decided not to renew UNIFIL's mandate. The UN Security Council will vote on the mandate in August, and the U.S. appears poised to axe the peacekeeping force with its nay vote. The Israelis reportedly know about this and are on board with the plan. This all makes perfect sense. UNIFIL has existed since 1978. It's supposed to keep the peace in South Lebanon, but it's been a clown show. UNIFIL stood idle for decades as Hezbollah entrenched itself in South Lebanon. Meanwhile, the U.S. has been footing the annual bill, which is north of $100 million to keep UNIFIL afloat. But now with the Lebanese government coordinating with the Israeli government through a U.S. mechanism, it looks like things are going just fine without the UN in the fight to dismantle Hezbollah. A John Grisham ending in the works here, folks. Hezbollah is getting shellacked and the UN is getting pushed out. Can't ask for much more. Oh, and yes, I'm following the ship of fools, the Thunberg Titanic, the vanity project of the purported climate activist turned keffiyeh-wearing Greta Thunberg is somewhere out there in the Med. What a stupid time to be alive. The Swedish-born proponent of Hamas seemed to believe that Israel was jamming her vessel's radar yesterday. Overnight, she released a video claiming she was, quote, kidnapped by Israeli forces. The Israelis have apparently boarded the ship, which they are now calling a selfie yacht. That's quite good. And they note that the ship is carrying a mere half truckload worth of aid. Not enough to feed more than a couple of dozen Gazans. It would be funny if it wasn't sad. Someone get that Swedish meatball out of the region ASAP before she does something even more stupid. I have always said this. This conflict brings out the worst in everyone. All right. It's time to welcome FDD's fearless leader, Cliff May, to help us dissect the latest out of Russia and maybe some of the others from what we call the axis of aggressors. So let's dive right in. Welcome to the program, Cliff May.
Good morning, John Schanzer.
All right. Let's kick things off a bit with some good news. Tell us about some of these remarkable things that Ukraine has been able to pull off against Russia in recent weeks, and what do they mean?
Well, most importantly was what they call Operation Spiderweb. This ended up as Russia's worst single-day loss of aircraft since World War II, and more specifically, since Hitler broke his non-aggression treaty with Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. And that was on June 22nd, 1941, just in case you want to mark the occasion with some warm Russian vodka and pickles. What they did, billions of dollars of strategic aircraft were destroyed without a single Ukrainian plane being even endangered. They used drones for this. These drones popped out of the backs of trucks. The truck drivers didn't know what they even had. It was an amazing operation. The only thing you can compare it to is kind of the grim beepers that the Israelis did. There were actually, as far as we know, no Ukrainians even in Russia for this. They went, a lot of these, you should know, these strategic aircraft, which can carry nuclear weapons, but were also being used to bomb Ukrainian cities, residential neighborhoods, hospitals, schools. Some of them were thousands of miles away in Siberia. They were not protected. They were simply out on the tarmac. Nobody understood that the Ukrainians could have this capability. After all, we thought that Zelensky had no cards to play. Well, it turns out he had at least one card way up his sleeve that he did play. So it destroyed an important part of Russia's strategic abilities, weakening America's second worst adversary. And by the way, it taught a lesson, not least to Americans. Our strategic aircraft are also very much unprotected. And with the Chinese buying up land, agricultural land and land near military bases, and with drones with various software and maybe hardware from China in it, we're in danger too. And with this lesson needs to be learned by the U.S.
Lesson learned indeed. I'm sure everybody is internalizing that right now. But in the meantime, you can pass the popcorn on the video of those Russian aircraft getting destroyed. That's just some wild stuff. Watch that on repeat for a little bit the other day, just sort of giggling. But then there's the bad news, right? I mean, let's zoom out and assess the war more broadly. Ukraine has lost territory that it's not likely to win back. I mean, am I right?
Well, I think that's right. Certainly in the short term, certainly in the medium term, I don't think so. If you could get a ceasefire, and that's what President Trump says he wants is a ceasefire, and I think he could get it, but he has to put real pressure on Putin, which he's threatened to do, but has not yet done. If he were to do that, what would happen? Well, a ceasefire and a frozen conflict would mean that about probably 19% of Ukrainian territory at this point is occupied by Russia. But keep in mind, in 2023, it was 18%. That's a lot of bodies paving that additional 1% that Russia has gotten. So yes, we're talking about the eastern and southern sections of Ukraine. The eastern sections actually have been in an insurgency that was precipitated by the Russians as early as 2014, the same year that Russia invaded, occupied, and annexed Crimea. So yes, they would lose that. But am I saying it's permanent? Not necessarily. Keep in mind, I don't imagine that after Putin passes from this earthly coil, the succession will be particularly smooth to the next leader. If there is a chaotic succession, it is possible that Ukraine could then take back its territory at that point. That's what I'm seeing. If not, you have a frozen conflict. What does a frozen conflict look like? We know the conflict between North and South Korea represents that. That war never ended. It's just an armistice, a truce. Since when? Since 1953, 75 years ago, also this month, in case you want to mark that occasion as well.
Lots of occasions to mark today.
We have a lot of things to celebrate and enjoy, and that's why it's such fun working with you, John.
Oh my goodness! Wow, I had no idea. All right, well, let's talk about some of Putin's other moves, because he's not yet left this earthly coil, as you call it. You're a poet, even at 8:42 in the morning here. I'm thinking about Moldova and Serbia and Finland and Norway, to name a few. Putin is not done yet, is he?
No. And first of all, let me also be honest. In response to the Operation Spiderweb, hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles have been raining down on Ukraine. Putin was obviously very angry about this, very humiliated, all of that. What else is going on? Well, we've heard from the Prime Minister of Moldova. He believes that there are going to be troops on his border very soon. And there is already a section of Moldova, the eastern section, it's called Transnistria. And the Transnistria is essentially already a Russian colony, has been since 1992. You also have Russian forces threatening Finland, threatening Norway. I had dinner the other night with an ambassador for one of the Baltic countries. He said that the Russians are hanging up so that one of the Baltic countries can see them, signs that say Russia's borders stretch to the horizon. Putin is signaling very clearly that his ambitions are not limited to Ukraine. If he gets Ukraine, then he wants to challenge NATO. And that's something we need to think about, because there are only two possibilities here. One is that, let's just suppose he decides to go into Lithuania. Why I say that? I've said that for a long time. I've written about that because he has a non-contiguous province known as Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea, and he might want a land bridge, just as he wants a land bridge to Crimea. Are Americans going to fight for a road through Lithuania to Kaliningrad? Because if they don't, NATO is toast, to use your analogy. And if NATO ends as an alliance, what happens to other American alliances? And don't you think Xi Jinping has this on his mind? He would think that Putin is really doing a good day's work for their no limits alliance if he were to smash NATO. And that's not impossible.
Well, I take the lesson out of all of this, Cliff, is that what Israel's doing in Gaza is really just destabilizing the world. That's what I take out of it, right? All right. Kidding, of course. I mean, when you start to hear about all these other things that Putin's doing, and you think about the intense coverage of the Gaza conflict alone in our media, it really is illuminating. But okay, getting back to Putin. All right. Now that we understand what's happening on the ground, I do want to talk about what's happening in his head. You have a good piece coming out soon on a statue of Stalin at a Moscow subway station. Tell us why that statue matters.
That's a statue, and it's a big statue of it. Shows, it's kind of like socialist realist. It shows Stalin. He's under a portrait of Lenin. There are all these worshipful Russian workers holding up flowers to him. It wouldn't be there if Putin didn't approve of it. And what it shows, and by the way, I did a little research on it and found out there's like 100 monuments to Stalin that have been erected since Putin came to power. Don't forget, previously in the Khrushchev era, there was what's called de-Stalinization. I mean, people recognized who Stalin was and that he was one of the great tyrants of the 20th century, right up there with Mao Zedong and Adolf Hitler. He killed millions and millions of his own people. Putin admires Stalin. Why does Putin admire Stalin? The quickest way I can tell you is this. At the end of World War II, two things happened. A number of countries in Europe were liberated by the US, and where the Red Army prevailed, those countries weren't liberated. They went from Nazi dictatorship to Soviet dictatorship. Essentially, they became colonies of the Russian Empire. And as I've been saying for years, Putin sees himself as the Tsar, and his goal is to resurrect, to restore the Russian Empire, and he'll bring it back to where it was at its peak, and its peak was under Stalin. And he also believes that Stalin was right, that, to get things done, you have to kill a lot of people. His old saying, I'm not sure this is, it's been attributed to him, is if you want to make omelets, you got to break eggs. Though somebody then said, so where exactly is the omelet? And if you look at it. Anyway, he admires Stalin. Keep in mind, Xi Jinping admires Stalin, always has. He is a Stalinist. Doesn't mean he's a communist, even a Marxist, but he's a Stalinist. And in a lot of ways, that's even worse. So that's what I'm saying. And really what my column tries to make is President Trump needs to understand what this Stalin statue and the other Stalin monuments and Putin's admiration for Stalin, what that tells us about Putin, which I don't think it's clear that President Trump has understood up to now. By the way, others haven't as well, going back to George H.W. Bush, who looked in his eyes and saw somebody who was trustworthy. Putin, I don't understand it exactly, but evidently Putin can be rather charming.
I guess so. He doesn't really look charming, I don't know. I'm not sure I see it, but I guess other people do, to each their own. Okay. We had to tie this all back to the Middle East. So tell us, how is Putin working with Iran, and how does that all tie back to the concept that you forged, which is that there is an axis of aggressors out there?
Yeah, there's an axis of aggressors. And what are we talking about? We're talking about Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, and Pyongyang. And Putin is very closely aligned at this point with the Islamic regime in Tehran. He's getting drones from them. They may be opening a drone factory for him. They have military and political cooperation. It's really quite remarkable. But all the members of the axis of aggressors, and they're different. One is Islamist, one is neo-imperialist, one is communist, one is a dynastic dictatorship. What do they have in common? They want to prevent America from being great again. They want to diminish America. They want the American-led international order. I know makes people's eyes roll to hear that, but there's always an international order. Since World War II, the U.S. has led it. They want that to end, and they want a new international order in which they make the rules. And those rules start with the Communist Party of China being the hegemon of Asia, Russia being the hegemon of at least Eastern Europe, Tehran being the hegemon of the Middle East, North Korea taking over South Korea. Now they want to go beyond that, but those are their immediate aims. So Putin has a very close relationship with Tehran. And by the way, good relations with Hamas and with all the other Islamists out there. He knows they're not going to bother him, despite the fact that he crushed the Muslims of Chechnya, despite the fact that he has other Muslim colonies within what we call the Russian Federation, but which is still the Russian Empire, shrunken though it is at this point. This is a dangerous axis and a dangerous alliance. And most importantly, and I think this is very much one of the things FDD wants to communicate, is the U.S. has to understand that there is this axis, that they are waging a Cold War already against the U.S., and we have to strategize and mobilize so that we fight it properly, because you never win a war if you don't know you're in it.
That's right. That is absolutely right. All right, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you, Cliff May, for enlightening us today on Russia on the FDD Morning Brief.
My pleasure.
All right, good stuff. Here's what FTD has on tap for you today. My colleague Jonathan Conricus appeared on the Henrik Beckheim podcast to discuss the current state of Hamas amidst the ongoing IDF campaign in Gaza. He notes that despite the elimination of tens of thousands of Hamas terrorists, the group continues to recruit new trigger-happy fighters, at times using humanitarian aid that they stole as leverage. But it does once again beg the question, are massive military ops the way for Israel to win? In his recent piece for JNS, my colleague Ben Cohen draws attention to the persistent patterns linking all forms of anti-Semitism across history, namely two big ones: violence against Jews or the defense of such violence, from pogroms that raged throughout Europe over 100 years ago to pro-Hamas protests on college campuses and the recent terrorist attacks against Jews in D.C. and Boulder. Ben's analysis is incredibly timely and a little disturbing too, if you don't mind me saying. Finally, my colleague Andrea Stricker writes in the New York Post about the International Atomic Energy Agency's recent report exposing Iran's secret nuclear activities and its cover-up of violations of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, while the IA Board of Governors plans to seek a resolution formally declaring Iran as non-compliant. Andrea emphasizes that this step alone is insufficient. The West must act urgently to restore suspended UN sanctions on the regime. We call that snapback, and we're hoping that it does, in fact, snap back. That's going to do it for today, folks. Stick a fork in it. We are done. If you want more smartness to read, check out our website and peruse our social media. And please do consider making a tax-deductible donation to FDD. You can always do that at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Wednesday for another fascinating, gripping, can't-miss episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.